Well, the Canadian or the Canada firefighters strike certainly brought to the fore again the whole question of privatization, the question of who should be responsible for operating essential public services such as firefighting, emergency medical services, water, sanitation, etc. Now, those opposed to privatization, happens to include me as well, trade unions, etc., many of them tend to blame the companies that win tenders from government to privatize or partially privatize these services. They're wrong. You don't blame the companies. What they're doing, they're legally compelled to do, legally compelled to carry out what they're doing. And also, at the same time, linked to this is always the argument about corruption. And don't think that corruption is anything new in South Africa or anywhere else for that matter. You can go back to, for example, 1720. That's the 18th century in Britain. Do you know that more than 500 members of the British Parliament and House of Lords were involved in one of the biggest scams of the time, the South Sea Bubble, as it was called, and actually resulted in the then Minister of Finance, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, going to jail, and calls within Parliament for bankers who were responsible behind the whole thing to be thrown into the River Thames in bags with snakes. It didn't happen, but nonetheless. Anyhow, it is even worse today because we're living in a world that is dominated by corporations, by shareholder companies and transnational companies. Now, these work on the basis of maximizing profit and dividends to the shareholders, irrespective of what damage this does to society as a whole. Now, if individuals behaved in this way, and don't forget that in law, a corporation is a legal person, we'd call them psychopathic, psychos. We'd probably lock them away. And companies are not crazy. As I said, they have to behave in this way. There's a classic example. It goes back to 1919, a thing called Dodge versus Ford, a case in the Michigan Supreme Court, where the Dodge brothers, before they made their own cars, were 25% shareholders in the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford decided, as a goodwill gesture to his customers, to cut the price of his cars. The Dodge brothers were outraged. They took him to court on the basis that it was the fiduciary duty of a company to maximize profit for shareholders and not to aid the consumers. And the Dodge brothers won. That basically, despite some tinkering around the edges over the years since then, remains the rule for companies. So they're not actually to blame. And anyone, therefore, who thinks that this system doesn't need radical transformation should also think, going back again to the 18th century, to Adam Smith, the father of so-called laissez-faire free market capitalism. He supported what the British government did after that South Sea debacle. They banned shareholder companies for 105 years, and that was before limited liability. They banned them for 105 years. Adam Smith supported the ban on the basis that shareholder companies were inherently corrupt. They tended to corruption. Well, that's the basis of what I'm going to look at in my Inside Labour column this week, which you can access on this platform, Fin24, tomorrow, and a version of which will appear in the City Press business section on Sunday. Well, there's plenty to think about there, plenty to criticize perhaps, plenty to comment on. Over to you, editor@fin24.com. That's where you send them to, all your comments, to editor@fin24.com. And for this week, that's all from me. Cheers.